50th City Expats Club is a non-profit social organisation and our speakers are volunteers. The club as such assumes no responsibility or liability for the professional reputation of or the quality of services provided by the speaker today.
Sunday morning, pleased to have one of our own again, Peter Henry Taylor, who's going to reveal the secret history of the United States in brief, because it's a long history, including almost unknown facts about US presidents of both political persuasions. You may have seen earlier that Peter was born in Liverpool, UK in 1933 and lived in the US for 52 years. He's just told me before he's got 3 different citizenships. So he can flit around the country, do his money laundering or whatever he likes to do, clothes laundering, or wonderful to have 3 citizenships. And recently, I think you said you just got married a couple of years ago. Yeah. And is 85?
A few months ago, you were
85. 85, and just got married 2 years. There's hope for us yet.
I think he might be the oldest speaker we've ever had at the point, actually.
So, without further ado, and to tell us more about the US and the brief history is Peter Henry Taylor. Please put your hands together.
Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
I am from Liverpool, which, as you know, is the home of the Beatles. I was born in the same hospital as John Lennon, and I had surgery in the hospital where Paul McCartney was born. Liverpool is a fascinating city, and it is a mixture of prosperity and poverty. There is one community in Liverpool where 50% of the population in any home have never worked a day in their lives, which is a disgrace, but they're trying to do something about it now. Meanwhile, the south of England, with all its money, has endless funds. I should start out with a small joke about Liverpool. These Liverpool people have had very little experience outside the country. That means that in one school, a teacher was conducting a class and she showed up pictures of animals and she asked the students to name what they are. So she held up one. That's a dog. That's a cat. That's a rat. That's a cockroach. And then she held up a picture of a deer. These kids had never seen such an animal. So she said to them, I will give you a clue about a deer. If your father is saying something affectionate to your mother, it's the way she will reply. She said, well, dear. And he said, do you know anything else that the wife might say? And there was absolute silence. And then one little guy at the back said, yes, teacher, I know. What is it, Tommy? It's a horny bastard. I am going to tell you a bit about Ireland, just to start with, to help emphasize that you need to get your facts straight, and that is my theme today, knowing something. And then I will tell you my Irish joke. The Irish famine was known as the Great Hunger. The government told the people that it was due to a potato blight. That was not correct. The Irish landlords were given permission to sell their land and make big profits. And as a result, the peasants who were on this land went hungry and starved. Dublin is the closest port to Liverpool, and as a result, millions of people came from Dublin across the Irish Sea to Liverpool. Within a few years, the population of Liverpool increased 25%. The people who came from Ireland came on cattle boats because there were so many of them. And the Liverpool people said these people are so poor that they can't afford a passenger ship. Then they noticed that on this ship, the people were eating corned beef and cabbage. That was because these are two products that do not require refrigeration. So the word went out that the Irish ate corned beef and cabbage, and this was their national dish. This is not correct. No Irishman at that time could afford corned beef or cabbage, so this myth about this being the Irish dish is not quite correct. Let me tell you my joke about Ireland. Patrick was at Mass one morning, and when he came out, the priest said to him, "How are you, Patrick?" And Patrick said, "Father, my dog has died." And the priest said, "You've had him for 13 years. Is there anything I can do for you?" And Patrick said, "I would like the dog buried in the church cemetery." And the priest said, "Oh no, Patrick, we can't do that. Why don't you go down to the Church of Ireland and see if they will help you?" And Patrick said, "By the way, Father," and the priest said, "What is that?" "I was thinking of donating €1,000 to the church if they would bury him." The priest's eyes lit up. €1,000? Patrick said, "Yes, Father." And the priest said, "Patrick, you never told me the dog was a Catholic." So we will move on now to the beginning of democracy. You all enjoy a democratic life. Much of the world does. Where did democracy begin? 1066 at Runnymede in the south of England. This was the foundation of world democracy. King Henry had not been consulting Parliament with his actions and was doing it on his own. So members of Parliament went to see the king and said, "Your Majesty, you have a choice. Involve Parliament or you will be executed." That's how democracy began. And it was written in what's called the Magna Carta, which is Latin for the Great Chart. You will be interested to know that the Magna Carta is written into the British Constitution and the American Constitution and many countries throughout the world. Now let's move on to the presidents. Abraham Lincoln was a liar and a thief. He said that he was a successful attorney. He was a failure. He wanted to choose a certain man as vice president, and Parliament wanted somebody else. So he bribed the members of the committee, and that's how he got his candidate that he wanted. Abraham Lincoln was a very smart cookie. He decided that because he had so many people opposing him, he would include them in his cabinet. And that's how it started. Now, you are all familiar with Obamacare, I'm sure, and you think that he introduced health care. Well, the history of the United States is quite different. Teddy Roosevelt in 1906 wanted national health care. And that then turned out to be a failure because he got involved in a war with the Mexicans. FDR wanted national health, but he also wanted Social Security, and he thought that if he included national health, then the Parliament, the Congress, would not approve of Social Security, so it was too much of a risk. John Kennedy tried to introduce national health, but that got sidetracked when he was assassinated. LBJ wanted national health, but he was afraid that the country would revolt against him. Bill Clinton wanted national health, but he made two mistakes. First of all, he had Hillary introduce the program, which is not suitable for a first lady. And second, when she introduced it, she never got Congress involved. Finally, we get to Obamacare. So you see that Obamacare is not something new. The United States is probably the only Western democracy that does not have national health. And I know here that when you hear national health, the first thing you think of is socialized medicine. This is not true. Obamacare has many problems, but he did not get what he wanted, simply because he had to adjust the program to what Congress wanted, and he made several changes, so it's not that successful. But it is interesting that now we have a Republican president and Republicans in office. There is great reluctance to change Obamacare. First of all, it allows children up to age 26 to come under their parents' plan, and above all, this pre-existing condition, which is very expensive for insurance, is built into the program. So whatever party you are, you will find it is difficult to change some of these characteristics. Let's move on to something about the different presidents. FDR was unpopular. Abraham Lincoln was unpopular. Teddy Roosevelt was unpopular. Every president was unpopular except one, Obama. They did a public opinion poll of him at the beginning of office and at the end, and not only was he popular, his popularity increased, and as an Afro-American who traveled to several countries in Asia, he is considered an absolute winner. Let's move on to World War II. Eisenhower was appointed Chief of Staff. He was the least qualified man to do this. He was in the bottom 10% of West Point, and he had no battle experience. But he was selected as Chief of Staff. Dunkirk, it was invaded in 1945, but The Americans wanted to invade it in 1942. And Churchill said, "No, your troops are not battle trained or hardened. We will go for the soft underbelly of Europe." So the Americans went to Algeria and Morocco, and the British to Egypt, and they worked their way up through Tunisia and Italy, and eventually conquered Germany. However, people wonder, why were the Russians allowed to take the capital city, Berlin? This was because Eisenhower knew that the war was very unpopular and that the casualties would be unlimited when he went to Berlin, so he let the Russians take over. The Russians actually lost more people than every other country put together. So if you want to know why the Russian history is so concerned with will power and success, it is because of this. Hitler asked Goebbels, what did he need as Minister of Defense? And Goebbels said, Spitfires. When Hitler heard this, he decided not to invade Britain and to go to Russia instead. And as you know, he who forgets history makes the same mistake. Napoleon went to the Soviet Union, and you know what happened there. And the Russians sucked the Allies, sucked the Germans in, and they were devastated, and the Allies won the war. Let us talk a little bit about personal information about presidents. The one that I like the most is Nixon. Nixon was a brilliant strategist, and he won the election because he knew every congressional district and how they voted. So naturally, he got into office. You will all think of Watergate, but remember, Nixon went to China, and he established a relationship there, which was an absolute world winner. Nixon had in his mind, had a national health program and a welfare program, but of course, because of Watergate, everything fell apart. Now let's go on to him a little bit personally. Nixon was an insomniac and stayed up all night, and he drank. During the night, he would call members of the cabinet to discuss some issue, but he was so drunk they could not understand what he was saying. So the next morning, they would go to his chief of staff and say, what is the current issue? And that's how they found out what was going on. Nixon, surprisingly, was a very shy man. He was due to play golf, as is traditional, but he did not know what to talk about, so he had one of his aides write up a biography of each player, what he scored, who he was, and where he was from. Nixon also hated to talk to people. He would have a state dinner, and he would agree to interview 10 people after the dinner. But he was very shy about this. So he would pore over the list of guests and pick 10 people, and he would tell his chief of aide that he only wanted to speak for 5 minutes to each one. members of the Secret Service would each bring up the selected guest, and Nixon's chief of staff would guide him on to Nixon. But he had to have a 5-minute watch. And so if the guest was talking too long, the chief of staff would send the next guest forward, and Nixon would have to excuse himself. The same thing happened in the church service. It was a great honor to be invited to attend the church with Nixon. Here again, he would pour over the list of guests, and he would treat them the same way, a brief talk, and then that's it. The final interesting point about Nixon was that he was due to go to Camp David to discuss a national security issue. He asked for a very attractive and competent secretary to accompany him. She had made other plans, but Haldeman said, "No, Nixon wants you, you go." They went to the conference, and on the way back in the helicopter, Nixon invited the secretary to sit next to him in the front, which is quite out of character. So we had the pilot, the secretary, Nixon, and 3 cabinet ministers behind. In the middle of the flight, Nixon put his hand on the thigh of the secretary and took it all the way up to the crotch. She froze. Everybody in the plane could see this. When they landed, he thanked her, and that was it. His biographer says that this was quite out of character with Nixon. He was a Quaker, very loyal to his family, and there is no explanation of why he did this. Let's take LBJ. He was a school teacher in a school on the Mexican border with mostly Hispanic children. He met Lady Bird at a conference. She decided that he had potential, so she married him. But in the wedding, none of the family came because they thought that she was crazy, marrying this poor guy, and she didn't deserve it. And you see what happens. And we used Lady Bird's income to foster his campaign. When he decided, when he had the chance to run for office, he said, "I am not ready." She pushed him. Then we move on to Reagan. Reagan was a Democrat and a strong union organizer in Los Angeles. He was a film star and was quite successful. And a young film star, Nancy, decided that she was going to marry him. So she arranged a foursome with 2 close Republican friends and Ronnie Reagan, and he fell in love with her, and they got married. She said that he would be a good candidate for governor. He said, "Nancy, I am not ready." Then he was requested to run for president, and he said, "Nancy, I am not ready," and she pushed him this time. So as the story goes, behind every successful man, there is a successful woman. Just to talk about readiness for power, let's switch to the Soviet Union. Putin was a KG member. Everybody of significance in Russia or the Soviet Union today is an ex-KGB. They run the country. So, Putin was in Dresden, which was the Soviet embassy in East Germany, and the changes were taking place so that it was going to become democratic. The Germans were at the gate of the embassy threatening to walk in. Putin took an old blunderbuss off the wall, which had never been used. He did not know how to shoot, went out into the courtyard and said, "The first man who comes in through the gate will be shot." And so the crowd dispersed. He was horrified at the failure of the Soviet Union, and you would feel the same way if the United States was taken over by Canada and Mexico. So it's perfectly normal. There was one alcoholic president, I can't quite remember his name, and he had to choose the next president. So he called Putin into his office in the morning and said, "Mr. Putin, I would like you to be the next president." And Putin said, "Sir, I am not ready. I am not prepared. I can't do it." So the president said, "Come back tonight, think it over." He went back and said exactly the same. "I can't handle it." And the president said, "Tomorrow I will announce you are president." So, we're talking about LBJ and about the other guy and about Putin. You just have to remember that things are not what they seem, and that often these men who you think are hungry for power are really not. I just ask you in this talk to just try and go behind the scenes and find what is happening. For instance, Reagan had a very successful presidency and the economy boomed. Why? Well, it was Carter. You see, when a president gets into office and introduces a program, it often goes into the next presidency to be successful. And you will think that Carter has a bad name, but the latest research says that he was actually one of the most successful presidents in the century. This is because he persuaded Israel and Egypt to be a partnership, which changed the Middle East. And he also did healthcare, introduced equal rights, had women in this continent, and they think this is Carter revisited. I ask you once more to try and look behind the scenes. And I will give you the famous French quote, "Le bois change la même chose," which means the more things change, the more they stay the same. Thank you for listening to me. Have a good day.
Any questions? Questions for Peter? Oh, we've lost his thought. He did that's our mission.
Okay, thank you. Peter?
Could you come forward? I have difficulty hearing.
Okay. You didn't speak about your latest president.
Just speak up.
You haven't spoken about your latest president,
The latest.
Mr. Trump.
Let's see, who is that? Well, I have been giving you facts and jokes. So what I'm telling you about Trump is a prediction. The nature of the presidency will change. We've had all these presidents, Republicans and Democrats, who just waffle about the United Nations, about North Korea, about Syria, about everything, and do nothing. Trump is a man of action, and whatever you think, he goes in and does it. Amen. And they say that the media actually got Trump into power because every day of his campaign from nomination, he said something. And the media loved it because the media has to make money. And they think that he is maybe behind this. And talking about Obamacare, you know, they're trying to change everything. Well, it's very difficult to change things. That's my opinion of Trump. He is going to be a winner. And as Wall Street Journal says, that if his policies are implemented, the stock market will have the longest bull run in history, 10 years.
Thank you. Any other points?
Just have
Over
you
there,
in the back,
please.
Over here.
I enjoy your talk and I agree with just about everything you said. I just want to give you something that you could use in the future if you give a talk like this, and that is, who was the last American president to be born into a slave-holding family?
Who was the last president what?
Was born into a slave-holding family.
Well, I don't know that.
I do.
Who is it?
Woodrow Wilson.
Oh, Woodrow Wilson. Thank you. It is interesting that in my research, I found out that the first American president who served for 1 year was an Afro-American and very popular. And the second who served for a year and was very popular was a Native American.
On your right at the back, please. On your right.
Thanks for your talk. Now I'm a bit confused. I used to think Demokratia originated in Greece, you know, the basic idea. And what you're talking about, yeah, this is the wash-up. Now, can you please clarify what is the real root? Demokratia means power by the people, for the people, okay? So, okay, we know Magna Carta and everything else. I mean, I'm from Australia, so we're washed up in British law. But can you please define the outline of democracy?
My opinion here does not change. It started in 1066. In the Greek Empire, it was democratic among the elite, but the rest were serfs. It was the same in the Roman Empire and in other empires. Democracy did not begin, in my knowledge, till 1066.
Yeah, you mentioned briefly Reagan, but Reagan, if I'm correct, and Thatcher, did they bring down the USSR as we know it and precipitate the fall of the war, or was it something else?
I think the failure of, did you say Germany?
No, I said Reagan.
Reagan. I think the what I stand by is still the truth. I think that he was very important, and I listen to what they say, but I necessarily can't agree. One more, please.
Over here, please.
The beginning of democracy was in 1215, Monument. 1066 was when the Battle of Hastings began.
Thank you.
Okay. No more? Thank you very much, Peter. When you come down, we have a those steps can be dangerous. Just come over here a moment. We have a certificate of appreciation for your talk on the secret history of the United States. It's great to see such a person with such a memory and an enthusiasm for history. Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you.